All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation. So my name is Christy Bird, and I am the chair of the Division 15 Race and Diversity Committee. The goal of the committee is really to advance the capacity of educational psychologists and related folks to incorporate race and diversity into their research, teaching, and service. And we're also promoting the work of scholars in these areas. We have a lot of exciting things that we're planning this year, and this is part of it. We in the summer we did a series of brief presentations about anti-racist and anti-colonial research approaches, and so now we're going to start digging into particular approaches, starting with today. Some of the other things we'll do this year will include another syllabus challenge. So this is where you get to take the opportunity to take a look at your syllabus or course that you are planning on teaching or currently teaching, and think about how can you expand the types of activities and the types of voices that you're including, and even what perspectives and values do you want to put into your teaching. That'll be another goal. And then of course we always have planning at APA, or activities at APA. So we're really looking forward to Denver and some very cool events there. All right, so just stay tuned to your emails for the exciting things that the Race and Diversity Committee will be doing. But now I want to introduce our speaker today. Wendy Castillo is a Mexican-American native of East Los Angeles whose experiences with an underfunded system led her to work in the field of education. She has worked in non-academic positions for the past 6 years, alongside an appointment as a lecturer at Princeton. And now she's an assistant professor at Montclair State University. So thank you, Wendy, so much for being here, and we're really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Share my screen. There's construction going on in my neighborhood, so if you hear some bangs, everything is okay. So I'm going to be presenting today. So I'm going to be presenting today most out of my book and a lot of other things that I've always just talked about. So the book is coming out next month, November 7th, and it is called How to QuantCrit, Applying Critical Race Theory to Quantitative Data in Education. And it's me and Camden Strunk, who is at Virginia Commonwealth University. And it is based off a working paper that just gained a lot of interest from the field in how to do this type of work. I'm really excited about this book because it's going to be open access, so it will be free. So anybody can download it at any time. You can also buy it, but it will be free. So I don't intend to make any money out of it, and I don't think most of us who write academic books intend to make any money out of it anyhow. So that's the exciting part about that. So today I have a couple of objectives, but before we get there, if you can log into Menti and put in that number at the top of the screen, 94241709. And if you could type in what words come to mind when you think of quantitative data, because data also exists in qualitative forms. Also, just wait a second as people are getting onto menti.com. Oh, did it unshare me? No.
No, we can still see your screen.
Oh, okay. Oh my gosh, what is happening? I'm sorry, I'm just having some technical difficulties. There we go. There you go. Okay. So a lot of you put in numbers, validity, p-value, significance, limited storytelling, rooted in racism, so-called objective, statistics, dehumanizing, positivism. So these are many of the things that we all think about. Signal from noise. And I'm just getting a sense of some of your preconceived notions of them. So I have a couple of objectives today. First, I hope that you can find healing in this work. Ooh. I hope that you can find healing in this work. For me, the act of putting QuantCrit into practice is going beyond theorizing, but putting it into production, because as Bell Hooks said, for in its production lies the hope of our liberation. So I hope that some of this work for you can be healing as well. I'm going to briefly review the history of statistics, critical race theory, and other critical approaches. And then I'm going to review quantitative critical race theory, QuantCrit, and some approaches to apply that work. And hopefully we have some time to review and wrap up. But the whole time we'll be using Menti, so if you can just keep having that handy, that would be really helpful. So this process is unsettling. And the reason that it's unsettling, it's because we have to unlearn everything that we've learned in statistics. Not to my knowledge, but I don't know other universities or institutions that are teaching statistics or data through a critical race theory lens. So everything we've learned has been based off traditional statistics. So we have to unlearn that, unlearn the ideas that is objective and neutral. And we have to think about how we're going to move forward, even though they may never be a perfect way of doing this work. And I want to emphasize that there is no right way of doing this work, and we may never get it right. And it will always be iterative and changing, but QuantCrit provides an approach for us to do this work. So before I get started, I'd like to think about how important numbers are. And numbers are very powerful. And this is an example of the US Census. And in the US Census, since it started in 1790, has changed the way it quantifies people based off of race. And it shows how race is a social construction because of the way it was constructed in the beginning and how all of the changes that happened before Black people were only counted as 3/5 and were counted as slaves. And not until 1850 did they become counted as full individual people. And for Latino people, it wasn't until 1980 did they get fully integrated into the census. So power is the way we quantify so many things. And even today, it is still really complicated with how we pick what is the right way to quantify people and if we should be quantifying people. Recently, the census made a change in March 2024 to merge race and ethnicity question. So before, you couldn't merge the race and ethnicity question. Hispanic populations were asked in a separate question if they were Hispanic or Latino. And now you can merge, now they're going to merge that question. But it creates a lot of tensions. And this is going back to the idea that there's no right way and we're always learning and iterating. It creates a lot of tensions because now Latino populations will be counted more accurately as a whole. But within the Latino community, the Afro-Latino subset will be undercounted. And so many advocates are very concerned about this. Other people are more concerned about counting Latinos generally, but now that we can count Latinos more generally and have less of an overcount of white people, because before Latinos were counted as white, we might have an undercount of Afro-Latinos, and they are the most oppressed in our communities. So it's always complicated and changing. But regardless of that, it's always been that numbers are always what dominates our society. It's what drives funding. It drove it in ancient Rome when they had a census to drive funding. It drove it in the UK and England with Doomsday to create property taxes. But not only Western society, Eastern society also had it, the Inca system. And American society also has been, as I just explained, had a long history with the census. So this is not just an American problem. It's been something that we've been going through for civilizations in the past thousands of years. But important to this is that modern statistics are contaminated by the roots of eugenics. And it's important to start every talk this way and every class of basic and advanced statistics. They were created to reinforce white supremacist ideologies. And using statistics now for justice requires that we reckon with this and that we recognize this, because this was giving Victorian racist attitudes scientific backing. And now QuantCrit is trying to use data for justice, and we're trying to flip it on its head. We have to acknowledge where it came from. And even as far as like post-World War II, the eugenics movement was no longer in favor. People were still using statistics to oppress communities of color. You can see the bell curve on the right, which is from 1994. And Murray argues that white and Black populations, as well as men and women, the differences stem from genetic differences, not systemic discrimination. So even though eugenics is the root, it's still happening in modern society just as recently as 1984, where people are using it to differentiate populations based on skin color and gender. So QuantCrit is an approach used to disguise, systemic racism in education and protect the status quo. And we're using it as a way to figure out how to examine how these systems are doing it, and provides us with a framework. But in order to do this, it's just always important to recognize where the numbers, where statistics and where numbers come from. And it rests on 5 tenets. And I'm going to go through each of these 5 tenets. Centrality of racism, which is the core of critical race theory. And that is that race is center and race is prevalent. Second, the numbers are not neutral, that they usually reflect the biases and assumptions of the elite. And categories as well are not neutral, nor given, nor fixed. They usually also reflect the preferences of the elite. Voice and insight, data cannot speak for itself. We speak for the data. By we, I mean researchers and people who are interpreting the data. And social justice orientation, which is an idea of working with numbers, but also working against numbers in this push and pull relationship. So with that, I want to ask you if you've ever heard of QuantCrit before this presentation, just to get a sense of like where your foundation and where you're coming from. That's exciting. I'm glad that in the last like 4 years, QuantCrit has really taken off. It's gone from like 30 articles to like more than 400 articles if you Google it on Google Scholar, which is really exciting. Oh my gosh, my image has been obscuring the text this whole time. I knew I was having technical difficulties and I was like freaking out. Sorry guys, I'm gonna try to fix that. This is so weird. No, not that. Not that. Is that better? Let me see. Is that better? Great. Now we'll move on. So I think it's important to be on the same playing field on like what critical race theory is. especially since there's been a lot of misconceptions and myths spreading around in the media. But critical race theory emerged out of a legal framework in the 80s and late 70s. And it was created by legal scholars Derek Bell on the left, Kimberly Crenshaw in the middle, and Richard Delgado on the right. And they wanted a framework that analyzed the legal system in ways that took it beyond classism, beyond the fact that the legal system wasn't objective, that it was in fact racist and entrenched with racism. And the idea is that if we allow our systems and policies to continue as they are without quote unquote racist people, inequities will replicate by race. And QuantCrit attempts to take some of these lessons and insights and apply them to our quantitative understanding. Now, you might have heard of crit quant and quantitative criticalism and QuantCrit. They are not the same thing. They are different. And I just want to differentiate that. Critical theory comes from Frankfurt School, which comes from Marxist thought. And it's an approach to confront the social, historical, and ideological forces and structures that produce and constrain it. So it is talking about the social and historical forces, but it's not talking about racism, and it's not putting race in the center. And critical quantitative inquiry, or quantitative criticalism, or crit quant, however you want to call it, was the first attempt to have a new approach to quantitative methods. It was rejecting positivism and post-positivism. And in the special issue by Stage in 2007, they had 3 commitments to shift the paradigm. And those commitments are about using data to represent educational processes to reveal inequities and identify social or institutional perpetuation of systemic inequities. But again, it's not focused on race. To question the models and measures and analytic processes, and to conduct culturally relevant research by studying institutions and people in context. Again, none of these are focused on race. They can be about race, but they are not necessarily focused on race. So I just wanted to get a sense of, did you confuse or the other critical approaches with QuantCrit? There's no right or wrong answers. I just want to get a sense of that. Mm, 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 mm. There's no options to respond to, so that doesn't make sense. You can go ahead and respond in the chat if you have heard of it before. Thank you. Can you say you've heard of the different approaches? And it's just to differentiate again that QuantCrit came out of Marxism, which critical theory came out of, which then we got critical quantitativism. So we've been evolving, I think, as researchers, and now we're more focused on race. And I also, before I do any presentation, I just like to always acknowledge all those people who have come before me. Some of these ideas may have or may have not been said by people already, but I know that I lean on the work of W.E.B. Du Bois when talking about a lot of this, because he was the first in my mind to use data for justice when he created the profiles of what Black America looks like in the early 1900s. Zuberi and Munilla Silva's White Logic, White Methods, Chicago and Beyond, which has really pushed my thinking, as well as Urban Institute and Child Trends. So the first tenet is, again, the centrality of racism, and this is at the foundation of critical race theory. And critical race theory has tenets, but there's no agreed upon tenets. But everyone agrees, I think, that the foundation of critical race theory is that race is central to all of our lives, and it's a social construction. And in the absence of a CRT analysis, QuantCrit will remake and legitimate existing racial inequities. So the first thing you can do when you start your quant analysis is to start with the acknowledgement that racism exists and is prevalent. So I think that's a framing that quant researchers are not necessarily used to. Like, how is that going to be different now that I'm starting like this? But you're starting with the fact that racism is central. So how does that affect every other part of your research project? How does that affect your research questions? Are your research questions framed in an asset-based perspective? Are your research questions framed in a way that is already acknowledging racism? For example, a traditional question might say, do fifth grade readings test scores differ by racial category? A potential reframing, if you acknowledge that racism exists, you say, how are schools and society understanding youth of color in the area of reading? How does access to early reading programs and resources enhance reading vary by race? What programs, resources, or variables alleviate the structural disparities? So you're starting with that assumption and you're putting the onus on the structures, the resources, the schools, society versus the individual here. And we know that test scores vary by race because of racism. So how are we getting to the next level of those questions? So I have here, um, I was hoping we could split into groups and we could think about how we can rewrite the following questions. And the questions I have here are Black students less likely to persist in STEM majors in college? Residential groups go to college at different rates. How might you rewrite this if you're thinking about racism being at the center, if you're thinking about an asset-based perspective, if you're thinking about the onus no longer being on individuals? So I don't know, Christy, if you can help with splitting us up into groups to figure out how to answer those questions.
Yeah, how many? Maybe 5 rooms?
Mm-hmm. Those are the questions. I just put them in the chat.
All right. So, okay, I've automatically assigned you to a room, so you should get an invitation in a second. Okay, it looks like most folks have joined a room. If y'all just want to hang out with us in the main room, that's okay too.
Think if you can send a message to them, the questions are the ones that I just posted in the chat again.
Okay, here we go. Let's
I think that went through.
Okay, I'm gonna pop into a couple and see how they do.
Oh, you popped me in. Oh,
I don't think I can send you. Can you join?
I'm having so many technical difficulties. Got it. Oh, no, that was me just admitting something.
Is Dr. Bird back in the room? Do you know?
I'm here. Yeah.
Hey, Dr. Bird, can you reassign me to a room?
Yeah, I think you were in room 1, right? Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. All right. Oh, okay. There she is. Okay, y'all who are here, I'll be back. Oh, wait, no. Amelia, were you in a room you need me to reassign you?
No, I just logged in.
Oh, okay. Well, we're in breakout rooms for a few minutes, and so I'll join back together soon.
Okay.
Good. So I'd love to know what you all came up with, and then I can share with what I came up with. So if you guys can share in the chat some of the reframing of the questions, and then I'll put mine up. How do universities classify students by race, and how do admission rates vary by those categories? What program strategies support engagement and community building for Black students in STEM programs? How do students choose their identity? Oh, I think I missed a couple. Oh, no, that was just 4, 5, 6. What experiences do universities provide that support Black students to persist in STEM majors? And then probably thinking about what happened before university too, right? What programs support racial minorities, high school students? They just, thank you, Sandy. It's exactly what I was thinking. Flipping the order of the question, starting with the institution as opposed to the students. What are faculty measure qualities that influence persistence of Black students in STEM? Yeah, I had some of those in mine. You'll see mine. Where do data identifying students' race come from? What barriers exist in STEM majors that impact Black students? So here are mine, and some of them are very similar to yours. So this is all in the book, and we have more questions in the book that we're trying to reframe. But yeah, how are STEM disciplines racialized? Some of you talked about STEM faculty, like what is the composition of STEM faculty? How do Black students experience the campus climate in STEM departments and programs? What programs, resources, or inputs? A lot of you were also talking about that. What resources supports what colleges need to invest and account for the history and exclusion of marginalized people of color from STEM? And then for the other one, how often do school counselors and guidance counselors discuss higher education with students from different racial groups? So you can quantify that by thinking about, you can do it with minutes, you can do it by times that you spoke to them. How do college preparation courses distribute resources between schools, and how does this correlate to school segregation and demographics? How frequently are college recruiters visiting students in different schools, which, as we know, they usually do not, very fancy Ivy League schools usually don't go to lower income schools. They did not come to mind. What resources, factors, or programs reduce disparities? How can schools and universities rectify the long history of exclusion and segregation in higher education? So you can see that a lot of us were thinking along the same lines and really maybe going beyond those questions. And that's important too, because maybe those questions aren't answering everything. I went into one group and I think they made a really good point. They're like, well, I have a qualitative and I have a quantitative. A lot of these issues are so complex that we need both methods to complement each other, to support each other in trying to figure out how to answer these questions best. The next thing I think that is really important for quantitative research to do is to define race and racism. So It's important to do this because we use it in our variables and our models and in our analysis. And if those don't align with our definitions, then we shouldn't be using those. The definitions should be based in the critical race literature and engaging with QuantCrit. So we want to avoid using race and racism. They are not interchangeable ideas. We want to avoid race evasive terms like diverse. If we want to talk about race, then we have to say race and be explicit about it, because people use words like diverse to be race evasive. So just being very explicit when we mean race, and when I mean race, I'm talking about the social construction that we've created in race. And when I mean racism, being very explicit if you're talking about interpersonal racism, you're talking about systemic racism, like what racism are you trying to study in your study or your research? A lot of times quantitative researchers control for race and ethnicity in their model. And people have said, well, I've controlled for racism, and that's when those two do not equal. And if we want to measure racism, that we need to construct better measures of racism. I was also in another group where we're talking about how we just need measures that are measuring the things that we care about, because measures have been mostly centered on white individuals and made by white individuals. So we do need to create new measures, and maybe we want to measure racism. And maybe we want to go beyond just asking the two questions of racism, which is how people have measured it in the past. Just asking, have you ever been discriminated against? Or asking if you've ever been a victim of losing an opportunity because of race. So maybe we want to like push ourselves to create better measures of racism. So I would just wanted to ask you if you've ever used race as a variable in a regression model to control for racism. And I think in the beginning of my career, I'm going to be vulnerable. I did, because that's what I was taught. Like, well, we control for racism is what my professors would tell me, because you put race in the model. But that is not racism. That is somebody's self-identification of racism, of race in your model, not racism. And if the people who said it's complicated would like to elaborate, you can either talk or you can put it in the chat. I would just love to hear the complicated part. For me, that's what it was. Like, I didn't mean to do bad, but I did do this when I started my quantitative training. Any of the 6 people? Oh, thank you, Adriana. She said, I've included it, but never thought that controlling for race was controlling for racism. Well, that's good, because it wasn't, though. Thank you, Adriana, for sharing that. I want to offer measures that currently exist for measuring individual racism. I am not endorsing any of these measures. I do think that the way we experience racism in this country and the way racism unfolds has been changing and continues to change. And what racism might have felt like in 2000 in Los Angeles is different than New York, than what it feels like in 2020, than what it feels like in 2024. So I'm not endorsing any of these, but these have been the attempts that some of the examples that exist to measure racism. So we have the adolescent discrimination distress scale, where it asks questions like, you were discouraged from joining an advanced level class and you were called racially insulting names. Index of race-related stress. You were passed over an important project, although you were better at the task than the white non-Black person given the task. Perceived racism scale. It measures both overt and subtle racism with items like, whites don't include me in study groups. I've made to feel uncomfortable in a classroom. The everyday discrimination scale. It asks things like, you are called names or insulted, you were treated with less courtesy. And then there's the racial and ethnic microaggressions scale. Oh, Adriana mentioned in the chat that she's always told she needs to include it. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, because I was also always told that too. And I never questioned it because I was like being a good student. But now we can talk a little bit more about that. You can also use some of this literature to hopefully explain it to the people who you're working with. Same with Regis, it seems like it wasn't conceptualized as racism, but something that should be done. There are other attempts to measure systemic and structural racism. A lot of them have used GIS and thinking about how like redlining is a measure of institutional racism, and then using GIS systems to understand where that happens. Polo and colleagues have used school level structures by using a combination of student demographics, sense of connectedness, perceived life chances, discipline data, and attendance metrics. And others have attempted to, again, use lots of different types of large data sets, including mass incarceration, employment, wealth, segregation, to calculate county level structural racism. So people are starting to begin that process of like, I want to measure structural racism. I know I need to look at multiple data sets and multiple things because this is related to multiple systems. So people have started to do that. And QuantCrit is also like pushing us to think more about how can we creatively think about these things. So have you ever attempted to measure racism directly? It could have been through a survey or much more complex using multiple data sets. Oh, I would love to hear if the people who are saying yes can would like to share with us what they have been learning, just because I think it would help us all. I tried to measure it once with kindergartners, and I asked, are there people who look like you in books? And I was just trying to get a sense of their like intrapersonal and interpersonal racism there, if they've, you know, just like if lack of representation would represent racism. And it was complicated because there were 5, so a lot of them, you know, told me they've seen a lot of animals in their books and a lot of berries and things like that. And Dr. Bird is talking about, she measures perceptions of racism, so interpersonal racism, and I have seen her scales. And then Tiffany's developing a institutional racial bias cost scale using cognitive validity protocols and quality interviews. That sounds really cool. So qualitative ways, measured explicit and implicit. Thank you for sharing. These are really interesting. So we want to avoid the use of white-centric models, variables, and analysis. And the first thing that we can think about is avoiding a comparison group that centers on white individuals. So when I, Adriana and Regis, when I was in school, I was taught implicitly, not explicitly, that white was always the reference group. I didn't question it, just like you didn't question to put race in there. I was told to put race in there, and white was the reference group. And centering whiteness alone is not out of line with QuantCrit, but centering it without an absent a critical perspective is. Why are you centering, why are you comparing students to white individuals? Doing this centers them, and AKA centers the status quo, makes them normal, and makes everybody else not normal. But if your research question is about comparing to white individuals, or for whatever other reason that is necessary, it is okay to do that. It's just not okay to do that without being intentional. For example, in this study here, it says, it is important to clarify that we use white high-income women as our reference group because we're talking about educational attainment, and white high-income women have the highest attainment of any other social locations we navigate. So if we were doing a wage equity study, we would use white, highly educated men. So they're not doing it to normalize it, but they're saying why they used it. So now I just want to ask you, and my answer is yes. Have you used white individuals as a default reference group? This is all anonymous, so I do not know who is saying what. So far, it's about mostly yes and some no. So what you can do instead, and I also like to offer alternatives. It's hard to be like, don't do this, but like they're like, well, what do I do instead? I used to get that. Well, perhaps you have a target for where you want Black and brown children or whatever target population you are studying need to be. So perhaps you want to compare them to that. So if you wanted a college completion rate to be 80% or 60%, that is your comparison, that target of whatever measure you're using. What is a livable median income? What should we strive for? And the reason I also say this is like, I don't think white children in this country are where we would like them to be. I don't think they have that average livable median income that is like livable in this country. I don't think they're completing college at rates that we would all agree with. I don't think they're reading. I don't think their math is at that rate. So if that's what we strive for, to be like the other white individual children, then I don't think we're going to be making the change that we want to see. You can also use effect coding. You can use this coding in your regression models, where your regression models, your default is the average. So it's it will say Black students compared to the average, white students compared to the average, Latino students compared to the average, and your coefficients will come out like that as well. You can also do within group comparisons, because there's a lot of variation within groups. The right-hand side shows access to enrollment to college, and you can see that the enrollment to college rates are drastically different between Southeast Asians and East Asians, as well as South Asians. So perhaps there's no need to compare to white individuals. You have enough information looking within groups. So there are alternatives, both in regression and both just for basic data. If you are limited by your small sample size, which is something that I hear a lot, like I have a small sample, so I can't do it. And you can use non-parametric methods. So in statistics, you usually learn parametric methods, which are methods based on the normality assumption, and they require usually above 30, even though I still think that's really small to apply these assumptions, above 30 sample size. But there are non-parametric methods, and the tests are here listed, that are equivalent to the parametric tests. For example, the t-test equivalent to the Wilcoxon T, the ANOVA equivalent to the Kruskal-Wallis. And these methods allow you to use small samples like 10, like 8. So I don't like it when people are like, oh, my sample is too small. I'm like, you can still use other types of methods that are just non-normal when you need to use them. Now moving on to the second tenet, numbers are not neutral. So the way we analyze data and the way we gather data reflects the interests and assumptions and perceptions of elites. And a lot of these are interrelated and cannot just be mutually, like centrality of racism, and this is how you apply it. Well, the way you apply one thing probably spans along various tenets. But maybe it's better, like this is the one that's more representative, but it probably expands along all the tenets, because numbers are not neutral. Why? Because of racism and many other factors. So there it is overlapping with the centrality of racism tenet. And so one thing you can do is you can switch from an outputs to an inputs approach. And that's what you were all doing, I think, when you were rewriting the questions. So if you do this, you start to capture the barriers and inequities that shape the outcomes. So example, looking at discipline rates by race, instead of looking that as the outcome, think about the inputs that went into that. So thinking about the class sizes, thinking about the student support ratios, thinking about the race ethnicity of teachers, the school resource officers, the school climate data, thinking about all of those things that go into creating those outputs. And again, a lot of you are doing this with your questions. You are switching from your outputs. We're switching from your outputs. You are switching them to an inputs approach. This is another example. Consider getting data on alternative input indicators for why low Latina have college completion. So rather than looking at, okay, their college completion is, they'll look at the inputs. What's the funding per pupil? What's the retention data? What's the transfer data? What type of institution are they attending? What kind of financial aid do they have? What representation of faculty and staff do they have? And then that was supposed to say, thinking about your models approach. So people just told me in the chat that they're required to put race in the model, and they are not told, you're just required to put that in, right? So what we put in our models is determined by people. Models don't create themselves, although you can have AI, create your models, but usually we choose the variables that go in your model. And the model will tell you the variation that is explained. That's what it's going to tell you, but it will not select the models for you. So one way to think about this is we always weigh prior literature in the selection of our models heavier. At least that's what I have seen. We don't usually weigh the lived experiences of our target population of what they think should go in the model. And then I think, I forgot who it was who was saying that they were doing their dissertation, and they were saying, they're like, oh, but we don't have those variables yet, the ones that I want to put in that maybe the lived experiences of people are. So we have to create those. And we do have to create those. And there is, there's a huge potential to do that. But when you put socioeconomic status and prior achievement in your model, you are in some ways erasing the racism that those students experience, because SES and prior achievement are entrenched with racism. They didn't experience SES absent of racism. They didn't experience their prior achievement absent of racism. They went to low resource schools. They might have been tracked. They might have had less experienced teachers. They might have had lower expectations. They might have had no role models or other inhibiting circumstances. So when you control away all of that, it soaks up all the variation, and what do you have left? Not much. So in some ways, it's important to think about how these big variables that we are all taught to put in, I was taught to put in SES and prior achievement, will erase inequities. So to appease your advisor or your supervisor, just make sure to do it in both ways and explain this. Explain that SES is soaking up all of the variation of all of their experiences, and you want to look at it as, independent from that, so just by itself. So that's my recommendation, Adriana, and I think it was Tina. So I think it's also, so again, going back to like what I just said, avoiding the use of white-centric models. A white-centric model would include SES, would include prior achievement, and comparing to white individuals. Avoid doing that in your analyses. And also think about being clear with your definitions. So this is an example that's in the book, and I would love for you all to go in the chat and think about what is not clear to you in this snapshot of New York City schools. What isn't clear? So this is what it's presenting. There are 1 million students, largest school district. Of those students, English language learners, 20% with disabilities, 73 economically disadvantaged, race in the city, Hispanic, Black, Asian, white, and then the number charter. What to you isn't clear or is clear? Race and ethnicity are conflated by, yeah, that's right, they are. The overlaps between groups, likely there's some, this is New York City. Intersectionality is unclear. Yeah, we don't know anything about the gender. Race and disabilities. Who's not in the school system? So some of the things that I thought about, and none of these, there's no right or wrong answer. Some of the things that I thought about is like, first of all, this is not a digestible visual. So in terms of like, that's part of QuantCrit is also making your story clear so that you can get to racial justice. Is English language learner, is that the right term? Are we talking about cognitive or non-cognitive disabilities? What is economically disadvantaged, particularly in New York City? I don't see Indigenous here, and I don't see a Native Pacific Islander. All the groups are conflated. Yeah, and the overlapping. Because this is New York City and it's the most diverse and largest school district in the country, I think they can do a better job of presenting the data rather than just using 4 big groups. And these are it's very common to use these 4 groups, and many places may not have the diversity of New York City, but I do think here they definitely should think about that. And so I have an example here of, this is UCLA, but it's right now it's Universidad de California because it's Latino Heritage Month. But this is I took this screenshot, and below their data, so above this is all their data. They just put the definitions of their data. So gender identity, they put exactly how they measure gender identity, how it changed, how they measure sexual orientation, and how that's different. So just being very clear with your definitions is also very important in terms of being transparent about your intentions and what you're talking about. Now, another way when thinking about data is not neutral is that you can merge your data and you can pre-register your studies. You can integrate different data sets to get a different view because multidimensional outcomes like poverty, SES, well-being, academic success, nothing will give you a full picture. Nothing will give you a full picture of racism as well. You probably need multiple indicators and multiple data sets to merge. Now, I think a lot of people have integrated and merged data sets. That doesn't mean that they were doing QuantCrit. The idea is to be intentional and to want to focus on race and racism and merge the data sets for that purpose and with that in mind. Because I know people will say, well, Wendy, Castillo is saying that if you integrate data sets, you're doing QuantCrit. No. Also, people have pre-registered their studies. I have pre-registered a study. I was not doing QuantCrit when I pre-registered that study. However, I think that if you pre-register your study and you're saying that you're doing QuantCrit, or you're saying you're being racially equity focused or racial equity lens, you can say, I'm going to disaggregate the data like this and like this and like that. And it's not an afterthought. But again, the idea is not that you do one of these things and all of a sudden you've done QuantCrit. No, you're doing it with that intentionality. And with that, we'll move to the third tenet. Categories are neither neutral nor given, and the categories are represented on the practices and biases of those who are in charge, the elites. But there is no one right answer. There's no one correct set. And even too many categories or too few can also mask or illuminate inequities. And the reason that we want to collect data, even though we know that race is a social construct, but we want to collect data because racism exists, and we want to remedy that and allocate resources accordingly. So we know that categories are not fixed. As racism in our society changes, these categories are changing as well. But these categories do affect resource and funding allocation. And studies have shown that the way you collect it, the different categories that you choose, will portray different pictures and therefore different ways of allocating money. especially in young people, and that's who I think a majority of us study. It's constantly shifting. Their identities are constantly shifting. So after George Floyd, many students started to identify as people of color who before might have been mixed race and now identify as people of color. So it's important to also collect this data frequently, not just once when they were a child or once when they were in high school. Maybe at the end of high school, they have a different identity. And this is a classic example by Gilborn, one of my co-authors, in a paper where he disaggregates data here. This is not disaggregated. This is white British versus Black minority ethnic. This is access to elite universities. But when you disaggregate the Black and minority ethnic, you realize that they're actually not equally accessing elite UK universities. Indian students are, but not Black Caribbean students. And so by not collecting that data or not disaggregating it when you have it, you're getting a completely different picture. And part of QuantCrit is also knowing that these aren't related to people's race. People are not biologically born Black Caribbean and don't have access to elite UK universities. It's the racist patterns of inequality that those students experience that are associated with racial and ethnic origin. It's the racism that is related to access to elite UK universities. It's not race. Race is related to access elite UK universities is how I was taught to say things, but that is not how I encourage you to interpret things in your work. And disaggregating data is not QuantCrit. I have heard people say, oh, Wendy Castillo says that if you disaggregate your data, you're doing QuantCrit. No, that's the bare minimum. And I just want to be clear about that. Like that is, we should be doing that. If you're doing QuantCrit or if you're not, that's the bare minimum. And that doesn't mean that you do equity work. But the benefits of disaggregating data are to identify unmet needs, to serve specific populations, to make sure that those services are accessible, and to improve those programs. And I cannot tell you what categories to choose because those will depend on the communities that you are researching with or researching. So it might make sense, depending on your questions, to ask your research question to ask different categories. But just with that in mind, it's important to think about how communities identify themselves. If communities don't identify as Latinx, then that might not be the best category to have them choose. And figuring out how to contextualize like where you're studying it. I will give you examples of others who have done this. So Irizarry collected data as racialized subgroups, and she had white American, white immigrant, and same for East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, non-white, Latino, white Latino, Black American. So that's the data that was collected, and it was from ECLSK. So she didn't collect this data, but she was able to retroactively make these subgroups because they made sense for her research study. Similarly, we have on the left is UC, the University of California. On the right, we have ARA. These are the categories that they landed on based on their populations. So you can see the UCs have a lot of categories for the Asian population. I do think they need more for the Latino population because California is very diverse. The Latino population is really diverse within itself. And then they have a couple of options for the African-American Black population. ARA also asks about, are you Latino, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, other type of Latino, and then has multiple sub options for Asian and Pacific Islander. So again, depending on the research that you're doing, you will ask different questions. Okay, so I have a question for you. From the race and ethnicity data you collect, do you know who inputs it? I think that is also something to be thinking about. every time I have received data, I am not sure who is inputting it. I am just given the data from the administration, and I think that is concerning. And I think it's important for us to do that research, and that is, qualitative research on figuring out who is actually filling it out. It could be the parent, it could have been the teacher, it could have been the school administration support. So, and when it's school admin or the teacher, it's very concerning because they could be re-racializing people who didn't actually identify with that race to begin with. And so these are just some suggestions on what to think about. Like, you might not just care about racism, you might also care about classism, heterosexism, cisgenderism, misogyny, ableism. And so you might want to ask those questions. You don't want to create arbitrary categories because it's easier to analyze. A lot of people end up lumping together all people of color. That is an arbitrary category. If you can avoid that, it's always good to avoid that because we don't want to lump everyone together since we're not a monolith. And it's also advantageous. I would recommend to do check all so people can identify with all of their identities and not have to choose one identity. And then doing the research on figuring out who inputted your data and writing that up in your report or in your research article. And then the second to last tenet is voice and insight. Data cannot speak for itself. So we are all going to be speaking for the data here. And we should all be contextualizing and interpreting the data. So what does that mean? It means that interpretations are what makes research, right? Without interpretation, data is useless. So we want to know, or articles and reviewers want to know, if it was significant or not. But significant or not is statistical. It might have significance in other ways to other communities. And we might also want to put it in the context so people can understand if it's significant or not. So if you're looking at, for example, college program A, and it graduated 70% of first-time Latino students, you might think that's good or that's bad, but really you have no idea if you didn't put this in context of the nation, in context of the state, in context of other students from that community, other Latino students from that community, and that we need to put up front. We need to do that work for for the people who are consuming our data, because the data will not speak for itself, but we can provide some of that contextualization to make those interpretations meaningful or not meaningful, significant or not significant, not just statistically significant. And Tabrone and Thomas wrote in their systematic review about this idea of ground truthing your data, which actually comes from geospatial mapping and ground truthing your data on the ground. But it's the idea of expertise being driven by the community and them really connecting with the data and grounding it in the truth of the community. And this can be done with data walks, with advisory groups, with data parties. Street et al., he's in Australia, and he had a group of 8 individuals, 7 who identified as Indigenous scholars. And through research, engaged with them, they did formal and informal meetings to really ground truth that data. I don't think he called it ground truthing, but that's what he did. So I just wanted to know if you've ever used an advisory board or an advisory board that included community, because those are different things, right? There's an advisory board, and then there's an advisory board that includes community. And I have started a youth advisory committee and used it to inform surveys that were not official research. I used to work at the National Urban League, but now that I am an academic, I really want to do an academic with quotation marks. I really want to have a community advisory board. I don't think that our institutions are made for us academics to have those, but I think they can be very informative. And for all the academics, Oh, it's Jen wants to explain the difference. An advisory board can also include like academics. It can include other people who are not necessarily part of the community. Usually advisory boards are always like academics and really big name people who are heading organizations, or sometimes if you can get policymakers. Whereas a community advisory board would be people more on the ground, people who are experiencing this. So in this case, it could be students, teachers, versus getting superintendents or the professor of Harvard in your advisory committee. So if you have me in your advisory committee, which sometimes I am, I would be I don't think I would be a community member anymore, because I haven't lived in my community in so many years. So I don't think that I represent low-income communities like I once did. But if you would have asked me when I was 18, I would have been part of the community. You can also interpret your results centering the reality of systemic racism. So effect sizes is a big thing in quantitative research. And effect sizes usually are, Z-scores. So they can be 2, 0.5, et cetera, et cetera. However, that is not taking into account systemic racism. So what Van Dusen did, and he did something that I thought was really cool, is that he used Gloria Letts and Billings' debt to society, to that concept, to interpret an effect size. And I'm going to read it for you. Society's educational debts before instruction were large enough that women and Black men's average scores were lower than white men's average pretest scores even after instruction. So society would have to provide opportunities equivalent to taking the course up to 2.5 times to repay the largest debts. So it's the idea that you'd have to pay 2.5 times. That is the effect size, but they did it in relation to society's educational debts, using Gloria Letts and Billings framework, which I thought was a really good use and like innovative use of QuantCrit. And you can also do it through data counter storytelling, right? Because statistics tell the average, but nobody is an average person. An average person is not a real person. An average usually refers to white people, the majoritized group, and they are normal, traditional, and we are supposed to aspire to that. And minorities are exceptional. So you can still tell counter stories with data, because the average isn't real. And you can also visually tell stories with your data. I do think that these visuals are very appealing. However, they lack a sample size and percentages that I think need to be added. But I think the graphic designer was on the right track with like really thinking about, how am I going to portray these numbers? Like, how are you today? And it was a questionnaire just for Black women and its impact on their leadership. And you can see the face of the Black woman and how she's feeling. So empowered is very different from not okay. And then you can see W.E.B. Du Bois was presenting portraits of Black America through and empowering. He was not letting the visuals speak for themselves, but making the visuals appealing so that people could identify with them. The last tenet is social justice and equity orientation. So you're not only working with, but you're also working against numbers, not rejecting them, but not accepting them as truths. So just in general, when we consume research and when we teach research and when we do research, it's important to think about whether me and you all are being intentional with the efforts to address our biases and are stating our assumptions clearly. The language that we're using, I see Blacks and whites thrown out all the time with quantitative research. The Blacks this, the whites this. So it's important to think about that. And the way we, as I mentioned, framed our questions and survey items and interpret our results. However, positionality is a big thing. And I usually start with this, but I'm ending with this. And positionality is seen as a best practice for many qualitative researchers, but quantitatively, and I'm hoping that I have been a part of this, we're really pushing them to have a positionality statement to understand our blind spots, our position in society, our biases. And for me, it's really important to think about it not only as, your identities, which are very important, but also your statistical training, what institutions you've attended, and like the powers and privileges related to that. And this is not a checklist, and none of this is a checklist, and definitely positionality is not a checklist, but it can be an iterative and should be an iterative process done with your team if you are still working on a team. And your team can call you out. I like to tell my team about my blind spots, and excuse me for being ableist with saying blind spots, but I forget about Indigenous populations often. They are not at the forefront of my mind because of my upbringing, which is very urban, which didn't have Indigenous people. So it's something that I like to say so that I can be called out and I can be reminded to bring that in, to bring that lens in, if that lens is relevant. But your team will have a position, and it's important to think about like what is missing here. What is this person bringing? They're bringing this perspective, and I need help with that perspective. So just knowing who your team is. So with that, I want to know if you've ever seen one in a quantitative paper. I am sure you might have seen one in a qualitative paper, but have you seen one in a quantitative paper? So I'm really happy to see that 5 people have seen it in quantitative paper. I've seen a lot of weird sort of ones, and some have not seen it. I'm going to share with you one example here. This example is from a white scholar, and he talks about his position as he is a non-Indigenous researcher. And as such, he's not intending to represent the views of First Nations people. This is in Australia. His intention is to examine this data to challenge conventional wisdom in the role that education plays as a pathway to employment and economic prosperity. So he's not trying to represent them. He just thinks that this is important work. And he understands that his ontological alignment with hegemonies, he benefits from a lot of them. For the book, I wrote a really long one. You do not have to write a really long one in your articles. I don't know if you have space, but I learned about statistics because I wanted to learn the white man's language. I trained in traditional experimental methods at a very prestigious university, and my training was not critical. I was trained in traditional and post-positivist work. And I think that's really important because this informs a lot of all the things that I had to unlearn and relearn. Also, I realized that after I graduated from my PhD, I was perpetuating the status quo because I was doing quantitative research the way I was taught. And doing research the way I was taught was perpetuating the status quo because it wasn't thinking about race at the center. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've learned from them. And I continue making mistakes, and I continue learning from them. And I'm a novice in critical race theory, and I do not consider myself a critical race theory scholar, but I look forward to fine-tuning indefinitely and applying the theory. I've attended 2 Ivy Leagues. That's a lot of privilege, and people believe that that type of knowledge is superior to others and more reliable. I do not speak for oppressed communities. I'm here to uplift their voices because they have a voice. And I recognize that my street race is mestiza, but in some spaces, I am a white passing Latina, and I recognize that that can carry some privileges. But most importantly, I recognize that my bias is to improve the lives of Black and Brown communities, and I don't want to get rid of that bias. I am proud of that bias. And all of the work that you read, I'm being very transparent about where I stand. Others are not, but they obviously are centering someone or something. This one is mine. If anybody wants to share their positionality in the chat, please feel free to do so, but you do not have to. So another way to think about doing QuantCrit is, besides positionality, is to go beyond the existing and overused metrics that center on white individuals. And some examples that I have here today are, rather than using test scores, which are frequently available, so we use them, no judgment, I've used them, to think about the ones that you do use, who created them, who was centered when they were created, and do racially minoritized folks value them? So things that I've come up with, and there's so many more, but number of cultural activities available to students, access to dual language and biliterate high school, number of available extracurriculars, belongingness, critical consciousness, agency, these other types of indicators. Reynolds and Tabron have looked at the inequality pipeline for principles of color, but rather than saying there's this many Black principals versus this many white principals, they looked at every single spot in the pipeline, every stage in the pipeline, and they made a rubric for where in the pipeline was diversity of Black principals being suppressed, reproduced, or actually diversifying it. So this way you can see where in the pipeline. Is it in the job description that like there are less applicants to these jobs? Is it in the screening? Is it in the written criteria? Where in the pipeline are we reproducing these inequities of principle? Pretty created new items to specifically measure Black students' experience in STEM. These didn't exist. The concepts, they didn't exist in prior surveys. So the concepts that she wanted to measure were acting white, Black tropes of an angry Black woman, same race friends, Black stereotypes and microaggressions. These are things that she thought were barriers in STEM and she wanted to measure. They didn't exist, so she had to go and create them. And I'm going to end with QuantCrit tensions and intersectionality. So statistical training is not happening through a QuantCrit lens. So we have to think about how we might incorporate this in the training of people who are quantitative researchers and the practices. We also have to think about logical landmines. When you make one equitable decision, you may lead to other inequitable decisions. So for example, when the census merged race and ethnicity, it was more equitable in the sense that now Latinos are being counted at a more accurate, precise way, but Afro-Latinos were then being undercounted. So it's really important to be thinking about these things. And then secondary data, a lot of us can't collect data. We're just getting the data that are given to us. So we have to be more reflective of our decisions, include that context. And no statistical analysis can really control for classism, racism. Even if you did figure out a measure, it's going to be so complex that you're never going to be able to do that. Critical measures to acknowledge issues with data collections that you were not involved in. So you should critique the measures. So if you're going to use them, which you probably are, just critique them. And then I wanted to end with intersectionality. When I began my journey of QuantCrit, I was like, if you do interaction terms in your regression model, you can measure intersectionality. And here you can see an example of Asian, male, and low income intersectionality, interaction terms, excuse me. And then I started to read more of the theory and I realized that that's not intersectionality. Those are intersectional identities. Intersectionality is about systems. And that's when I felt that numbers, that's when it really hit me that there's just, and I should have known this, there's limitations to numbers. Like you can get, and we should try to be better and aspire to be able to measure these things, but we will never be able to measure racism. We will never be able to measure feminism. And maybe measuring racism with sexism would be the best case of intersectionality. But we don't have that. And we can measure intersectional identity. We can do interaction terms, like I mentioned. You can do cross tabulations. You can even do a very sophisticated analysis called MIDA that allows you to look at small sample sizes within bigger sample sizes. So Black women in STEM. But it's important for us to acknowledge that numbers will never be able to get to the richness, the complexity, the historical legacy of all of these systems. And with that, I want to leave you with just some food for thought. If we're using the correct methods, or are we just not applying them correctly, or do we need to totally rethink our methods and restart from the beginning, or maybe do both of them at the same time? So is it the question asking or the application, or is it the actual methods? And none of this will upend systemic racism, but I still think we should do it. I think it will make us better racial researchers. And I just want to leave you with that. Is QuantCrit just good research practice? Should we all just be doing research through this lens? And I will stop there for any questions and discussion. Here's my, I'm gonna put it in the chat. Here's my contact information.
Well, thank you, Dr. Castillo. So we have time for questions if folks want to unmute or put in the chat. You can go ahead.
Hi, Wendy.
Hello,
Hi.
Jen.
How are you? I'm wondering, do you have a particular article that maybe you've written or co-authored that is on this particular subject matter that, and maybe it's in the reference section in your slides, but because I was trying to read your slides, that you would recommend as more of like, do you have a paper that might be like a framework or suggest, like I was taking notes really rapidly to tell doctoral students about this seminar, but like, do you have something that might be like a framework that like where you ask yourself as you go through your research? Because I like the tenets, how you laid out the tenets. Do you have something that might be like a framework for like ask yourself this, then ask yourself this, or something like that?
I think the working paper, which the textbook is based off of, or not textbook, the book is based off of, at the end of it, there are like a list of questions. Yeah,
Okay.
there's still questions to be thinking about it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Dr. Castillo, thank you for this presentation. It was so informative and helpful. I wanted to ask you about journals and submitting QuantCrit work. Have you come into any issues doing this? And for those like attempting to do that now, do you have any recommendations of steps or places to apply?
I think yes, I have, because not everybody's ready for this work. So I would see like, where has QuantCrit been published? Like it was published in Race, Education, Ethnicity. That's where the first special issue is. So obviously there, but maybe that's not like the best place for your work or the best fit. So where else have other QuantCrit scholars published? And then published there. If nothing has ever been published of QuantCrit, I would suggest reaching out to the editor, because they might, I mean, it's just, you don't want to waste your time, right? So I think I have two that I want to reach out to the editor because they've never published QuantCrit before. And I think it's just going to save me a lot of time. Because I have encountered where people are like, well, this I don't make the theorist happy. So if you don't want to go to a too theoretical, or then I don't make the quantitative people happy. So it's like, you're not making anybody happy here. So like, just want to make sure that they like, when you're trying to bring these two together, that you're there. The Journal of Experimental Education would welcome QuantCrit work. Oh, I have a paper for that. Methods journals. I don't know which journal.
Thank you.
That's good to know, that the Journal of Experimental Education. Don't be afraid to reach out to the editors, because it's just going to waste our times. Like all of that, it takes too much.
I have a question. I'm wondering if you have gotten pushback from other people who use critical race theory who feel like quantitative methods are less redeemable. Like you have a, sort of an optimistic view that we can use these, or at least I'm interpreting that. And so have you gotten some pushback from the other side? Yeah.
I do think that some people, the theorists, believe in QuantCrit as like a theory, but I don't think they believe in it as like doing it, if that makes sense. And people believe that we're getting too ahead of the methods without thinking too much about the theory. But I also think that we can be thinking about those simultaneously because people are using these methods for harm. And I just like, if we can make any changes to try to like prevent that, I would want to also do that. But I have gotten pushback, and I also think it's an empirical question too. Like, and that will be answered in 20 years. Like, can we use these methods for justice? I'm not sure, but I'm like gonna try and like do it and see what happens. But I think that that's a meta question. Like, can you use them? I don't know, because I think you got to use all tools. So you also have to create new ones that are really aligned to the theory too, because these were obviously aligned with eugenicists. But I'm not going to create new methods just because I don't think I have the bandwidth for that or capacity to create new methods. But I think if other people are, I think that that's going to be the real question. Can we use these methods, or do we need to create new methods? Like my big question right now is, can we use randomized control trials with a QuantCrit perspective? Like, can this post-positivism mindset be used? I don't know. And I don't know if it's ever been tried. I want to try it, but I don't know.
Yeah, it seems like that could be a whole line of research. Like, can you create a new method or, modify existing ones?
So that's why I went back to academia after 6 years, because I was like, I just want to like think about this more. And unfortunately, that's like what academics get, and like practitioners don't get to have that space. It's a privilege to have that space, and I didn't have that space.
Looks like we've got a question in chat about small sample sizes.
So I would look at the non-parametric method. So it will be in the book, but thinking about like, obviously privacy is more important. So I don't know if your cutoff is 5 or 10, but if you have more than 5, you can do analyses with that using non-parametric methods. So those are our, like the main suggestion is to really think about how you can, and even just acknowledging that those people are in the data is just one step up versus like lumping them into other or not even acknowledging them at all. I think focus groups are similar, but like community advisory are like, it should be done from the beginning of like, ideally the community would set the research agenda of what they want to study. That's like the ideal participatory method, but like you're engaging them multiple points and they feel like they are a part of the research project. And then you can actually do full on participatory where they're actually like researchers and co-authors. But I think a focus group is like light, for example, light versus like high touch.
All right, well, last call for questions. Well, thank you all for being here. We definitely want to give a big thank you to Dr. Wendy Castillo, yay, for this fabulous presentation. This is again just the first or the second in our series to really focus on building research skills for educational psychologists and folks who are affiliated with us and who like us. But the Race and Diversity Committee is really committed to helping expand our thinking about what can our research and our teaching be like. So thank you for joining me in this endeavor, and I hope you all have a great afternoon. And submit to JXC.